Thursday, the 6th of October, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. Israel's border troops, below strength during the holiday, came under surprise attack by Syrian and Egyptian forces 10 times greater than their own. In particular, the Egyptians, who fought their way across the Suez Canal with spectacular success, and then engaged them in the biggest and bitterest tank battles since the Second World War. Soviet missile systems challenged the now established superiority of the Israeli Air Force, hindering their attempts to carry out ground support roles in the first hours of the war. And on the ground, the apparently invincible Israeli armor came up against a new generation of anti-tank missiles. Israel still had less than half the number of men, tanks and planes, and a fraction of the missiles that Egypt and Syria could field against them. The tanks joined 1,000 other guns, pouring tons of high explosive onto the Bar-Lev line, while an airstrike hit Israeli positions deep in Sinai. It was the start of a technically brilliant operation that would restore Arab military credibility. The Egyptians were so proud of it that months later, their Third Army reenacted the whole exercise for the cameras. Hundreds of machines wreathed the West Bank and the canal in smoke. Screened from Israeli eyes, 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber dinghies at midpoints between the forts. In 1971, the Israelis had tested a method of pouring oil onto the canal from an underground system and turning it into a wall of flame. The Egyptians took no chances. The night before, frogmen had blocked pipes leading down to the canal. Once the first wave had scaled the bank and established a foothold, tank hunting units moved inland to await the first Israeli armor, equipped with RPG-7 anti-tank weapons, and the latest Soviet anti-tank missile, the Saga. Unfolded from a suitcase, it could be set up in minutes. Its wire guidance system and 3,000-yard range demanded courage and skill from the operators. Each had fired 100 rockets during training. It wrought havoc among the Israeli tanks. One unit alone claimed 8 tanks in the first 10 minutes. With a tank defense now in place and heavier equipment arriving, the second phase of the operation could begin. Designated teams began clearing the Israeli defenses, where the Jerusalem Brigade, after the initial shock, were now fighting back. Further south on the Bitter Lakes, an amphibious operation was underway. Tanks and troop carriers of the Third Army poured more men into the Sinai. In imitation of Israeli tactics, heli-borne troops had been dropped behind the lines. The 130th Marine Brigade had orders to join them in the desert. It was the only failure of the whole operation. The Israelis shot down 14 loaded helicopters, and the survivors achieved little. The Egyptian generals had estimated they would lose 10,000 men in crossing the canal alone. In fact, the barrage kept most Israelis in their bunkers. And throughout this most dangerous and exposed phase of the operation, only 208 men were lost. The problem of how to cut through the sandbanks was solved by an ingenious Egyptian lieutenant who had worked on the construction of the Aswan Dam. British irrigation pumps powered high-pressure hoses which simply washed the sand into the canal. Using this technique, they cut the holes in half the time it would have taken with either explosives or bulldozers. And during the first day, they cut 60 of them. Cutting the gaps was a feat of Egyptian ingenuity, but bridging the canal was achieved through well-tried Soviet expertise and equipment. PMP bridges designed to cross European rivers were put into use for the first time under wartime conditions. The sectional pontoons could be joined to others in minutes. On a day, the Israeli garrison said they grew across the river like outstretched arms. Another Soviet crossing system was even quicker. The GSP ferry was formed by two amphibious lorries which linked together in the water and would then expand hydraulically, creating a platform that could carry a tank across the canal in a matter of minutes. Every aspect of the crossing operation had been thoroughly rehearsed and planned in minute detail by General Shazli's staff, with two goals in mind: surprise and speed. The whole Israeli defensive system in Sinai turned on the assumption that it would take 48 hours to get armoured divisions and heavy equipment across. They were convinced they could foil any attack in that time. In 10 hours, the Egyptians had already got 10 bridges set up and 500 tanks positioned on the east bank. Inside 24 hours, 2 infantry and 2 armoured divisions had crossed the canal. It was the high point of the war for Egypt. Within 30 minutes of the start of the war, the Israeli armoured reserve drove forward into the line according to plan, unaware of the reception that awaited them. They were decimated by the Egyptian tank hunting squads. And that disadvantage was now becoming clearer as the Egyptians consolidated their hold on the east bank. If they survived the missiles, the Air Force still had to locate the bridges hidden beneath smoke screens. Even when hit, their sectional construction made them easy to repair, and they could be floated to new crossing points with relative ease. Egyptian troops rejoiced in their achievement. They had destroyed the first counterattacks exactly according to plan, and now one by one, they were taking possession of the forts along the Bar-Lev line. Not all fell easily, though. The northernmost fort was never taken. And in the south, opposite Port Tewfik, 1 officer and 42 men held out for a week before surrendering through the Red Cross. After repeated attacks, they were down to their last few grenades and bullets. The Egyptian officer who took over the fort believed they'd hidden their heavy weapons. The truth was, they had none. They were ferried across to Port Tewfik, where the survivors helped their wounded comrades ashore and into captivity. In those first few days in Sinai, only the Egyptians had cause to celebrate. The Sinai front was 125 miles from the main Israeli cities, but in the north there was no margin for error. The Golan Heights were barely 17 miles across. As in Sinai, the Israeli Air Force was thrown in to slow the advance. But even at low level, running the gauntlet of the SAM batteries proved costly. They lost 40 planes in the first afternoon. By Monday morning, though, 36 hours into the war, the roads to the Golan were jammed with troops and equipment, in civilian as well as military lorries. Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war. Casualties had been heavy. They lost 250 men in the first 2 days in the Golan.
I am glad to tell you that we managed to push almost all of the Syrian forces to the ceasefire line.
But they were not stopping there.
We continue our counterattack. We shall continue it tomorrow, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
Israelis had cleared most of the Golan, but they could not switch to Sinai until the Syrian threat was destroyed. So they attacked again in the northern sector, using Mount Hermon as cover for their left flank. And having destroyed the bulk of the Syrian missile system, they were now attacking targets all over Syria, disrupting the Soviet airlift of military supplies. The Soviet Union was forced to move its own fleet to keep Syrian ports open. The Americans responded by reinforcing their 6th Fleet, a thinly veiled warning against further Soviet involvement. The Israeli advance continued along the Damascus Road until it ran up against the main Syrian defense line around Sassa. Now within artillery range of southern Damascus, the Israelis were content to hold their ground, switching forces to the Sinai front. And Sadat's drive to address the Egyptian People's Assembly on the 16th was akin to a Roman triumphal march. He and General Ismail were mobbed as they entered the assembly. They had given the Egyptian people a tremendous victory, restoring their national pride. In his address, President Sadat described the crossing of the canal as a miracle by any military standard, and went on to say the nation could feel safe and secure. It was now armed with a sword and a shield. But even as he spoke, a column of Israeli tanks was busy demolishing Egypt's shield. Not in Sinai, but in Africa. The Israelis had crossed the canal, and with no reserves to stop them, they were rampaging deep behind the Egyptian lines. The Israelis had launched a counterattack on the 15th under General Sharon, forcing a passage through the Egyptian bridgehead and across the canal, where it began destroying the missile sites. It had been a risky affair. The hardest battle had been on the eastern bank near Chinese Farm, as paratroopers, armor and artillery fought for 2 days to stop the Egyptians from closing the gap behind the task force. Once across the canal, they'd found the ground undefended. The Egyptian armor was on the wrong bank. They moved freely over the Sweetwater Canal and began combined attacks on the missile batteries. But Sadat dismissed the Israeli crossing as a mere television operation and secretly relieved Shazli of his command. It was the American airlift of military equipment to Israel that finally convinced Sadat of the gravity of his position. Material losses had been enormous on both sides, but he had expected the Israelis to grind to a halt long before his own Soviet supplies ran dry. Now he was forced to ask the Russians to arrange a ceasefire.
We are creating the necessary conditions to open our major offensive.
The Israelis now had 2 bridges across the canal, and their presence on the west bank was growing stronger by the hour. They now tightened their grip on the towns and villages within an area of 1,200 square kilometers. The front line continued to expand, taking out more missile sites, punching a wider hole in the anti-aircraft umbrella, which allowed Israeli planes to threaten the Second Army positions further north. The evident delight of these soldiers was not shared by all Israelis.
No, I don't agree, because the Egyptians think that they succeeded in this war. They think that if they have placed some few hundreds of soldiers and tanks in our bank of the canal, then they think that this is a victory for them. And when the Arabs think that they have won or they have a big victory, this encourages them. And the next thing you'll know is that in a year or two, we'll have another war and more casualties.
By the 24th, they had cut the Suez to Cairo road at kilometer 101 and were only 60 miles from the Egyptian capital itself. The Israeli drive had now trapped the Egyptian Third Army in Sinai, cutting all its supply lines. They now held a tremendous bargaining counter in the south. In the north, the elite Golani Brigade fought a bitter battle to recapture Mount Hermon, losing 70 men. 8 hours before the ceasefire on the 22nd, their pennant was raised alongside the Israeli flag on the summit. Now the Israeli flag flew in Africa too. As the second ceasefire came into effect, the 2 armies watched each other warily across the canal from reversed positions. This time, United Nations troops had been sent to enforce it and to arrange the passage of supplies through Israeli checkpoints. It was a remarkable turnaround. The initial Egyptian triumph had been cut from under them. A whole army was now dependent on Israeli goodwill in order to survive. Each side had lost territory to the other, but with the missile shield torn open and 20,000 Egyptians captive in the desert, the Israelis now held the upper hand. At kilometer 101 on the Cairo road, for the first time ever, an Egyptian delegation arrived to negotiate directly with representatives of a country whose existence it did not even recognize.